The Secret Garden, Chapter 8, Part 1. The Robin Who Showed the Way. She looked at the key quite a long time. She turned it over and over and thought about it. As I have said before, she was not a child who had been trained to ask permission or consult her elders about things. All she thought about the key was that if it was the key to the closed garden and she could find out where the door was, she could perhaps open it and see what was inside the walls. And what had happened to the old rose tree? It was because it had been shut up so long that she wanted to see it. It seemed as if it must be different from other places, and that something strange must have happened to it during 10 years. Besides that, if she liked it, she could go into it every day and shut the door behind her, and she could make up some play of her own and play it quite alone, because nobody would ever know where she was, but would think that the door was still locked and the key buried in the earth. The thought of that pleased her very much. Living, as it were, all by herself in a house with 100 mysterious closed rooms, and having nothing whatsoever to do to amuse herself, had set her inactive brain to work, and was actually awakening her imagination. There is no doubt that the fresh, strong, pure air from the moor had a great deal to do with it. Just as it had given her an appetite, and fighting with the wind had stirred her blood, so the same things had stirred her mind. In India, she had always been too hot and languid and weak to care much about anything. But in this place, she was beginning to care and to want to do new things. And already, she felt less contrary, though she did not know why. She put the key in her pocket and walked up and down her walk. No one but herself ever seemed to come there, so she could walk slowly and look at the wall, or rather at the ivy growing on it. The ivy was a baffling thing. However carefully she looked, she could see nothing but thickly growing, glossy, dark green leaves. She was very much disappointed. Something of her contrariness came back to her as she paced the wall and looked over it at the treetops inside. It seemed so silly, she said to herself, to be near it and not be able to get in. She took the key in her pocket when she went back to the house, and she made up her mind that she would always carry it with her when she went out, so that if she should ever find the hidden door, she would be ready. Mrs. Medlock had allowed Martha to sleep all night at the cottage, but she was back at work in the morning with cheeks redder than ever and in the best of spirits. "I got up at 4 o'clock, she said. "It was pretty on the moor, with the birds getting up and rabbits scampering about and the sun rising. I didn't walk all the way. A man gave me a ride in his cart. I can tell you I did enjoy myself." She was full of stories of the delights of her day out. Her mother had been glad to see her, and they had got the baking and washing all out of the way. She'd even made each of the children a dough cake with a bit of brown sugar in it. I had 'em all piping hot when they come in from playing on the moor, and the cottage all smelt all nice, clean, hot bacon. There was a good fire, and they just shouted for joy. Our Dickon, he said our cottage was good enough for a king to live in. In the evening they had all sat round the fire, and Martha and her mother had sewn patches on torn clothes and mended stockings, and Martha had told them about the little girl who had come from India and had been waited on her whole life by what Martha called blacks, until she didn't know how to put on her own stockings. "They did like to hear about you," said Martha. "They wanted to know all about the blacks and about the ship you came in. I couldn't tell 'em enough." Mary reflected a little. "I'll tell you a great deal more before your next day out," she said, "so that you will have more to talk about. I dare say they would like to hear about riding on elephants and camels, and about the officers going to hunt tigers." "My word," cried Martha, delighted. "It would set 'em clean off their heads. Would thou really do that, miss? It would be the same as a wild beast show, like we heard they had in York once." "India is quite different from Yorkshire," Mary said slowly, as she thought the matter over. "I never thought of that. Did Dickon and your mother like to hear you talk about me?" "Why, our Dickon eyes nearly set out of his head," answered Martha. "But mother, she was put out about you seeming to be all by yourself. She said, 'Hasn't Mr. Craven got no governess for her, not no nurse?' And I said, 'No, he hasn't, though Mrs. Medlock says he will when he thinks of it. But she says he mayn't think of it for 2 or 3 years. I don't want a governess.' said Mary sharply. But Mother says you ought to be learning your books by this time, and you ought to have a woman to look after you. And she says, now, Martha, you just think how you'd feel about in a big place like that, wandering about alone and no mother. You do your best to cheer her up, she says. And I said I would. Mary gave her a long, steady look. You do cheer me up, she said. I like to hear you talk. Presently Martha went out of the room and came back with something held in her hand under her apron. What dost thou think? She said, cheerful. I've brought thee a present. A present? Exclaimed Mistress Mary. How could a cottage full of 14 hungry people give anyone a present? A man was driving across the moor peddling, Martha explained, and he stopped his cart at a door. He has pots and pans and odds and ends, but Mother has no money to buy anything. Just as he was going away, Elizabeth Ellen called out, Mother, he's got a skipping rope with a red and blue handle. And Mother, she calls out quite sudden, Here, stop, mister, how much are they? And he says 2pence. And Mother, she began fumbling about in her pocket, and she says to me, Martha, thou hast brought thee thy wages like a good lass, and I've got 4 places for every penny, but I'm just going to take a 2pence out of it to buy that child a skipping rope. And she bought one, and here it is. She brought it out from under her apron and exhibited it quite proudly. It was a strong, slender rope with striped blue and red handles at each end. But Mary Lennox had never seen a skipping rope before. She gazed at it with a mystified expression. What's it for? She asked curiously. For? Cried Martha. Does that mean they've not got skipping ropes in India? For all they've got elephants and tigers and camels? No wonder most of them blacks. This is what it's for. Just watch me. And she ran into the middle of the room, taking a handle in each hand, and began to skip and skip and skip, while Mary turned in her chair and stared to watch her. And the queer faces in the old portrait seemed to stare at her too, and wonder what on earth this common little cottager had the impudence to be doing under their very noses. Martha did not even see them. The interest and curiosity in Mistress Mary's face delighted her, and she went on skipping and counted as she skipped until she had reached 100. I could skip longer than that, she said, when she stopped. I've skipped as much as 500 when I was 12, but I wasn't as fat as I am now, and I was in practice. Mary got up from her chair and began to feel excited. It looks nice, she said. Your mother is a kind woman. Do you think I could ever skip like that? You just try it, urged Martha, handing her the skipping rope. You can't skip 100 at first, but if you practice, you'll mount up. That's what Mother said. She says, nothing will do her more good than a skipping rope. It's the sensiblest toy a child can have. Let her play out in the fresh air skipping, and it'll stretch her legs and arms, give her some strength in 'em.